Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Talent War Group podcast, produced by EF Overwatch. Thanks for joining us today. We got a great panel, we got a great discussion lined up for you, and we're excited to get going. So today, we're going to talk about contingency planning. But what's contingency planning? It means that nothing ever goes according to plan. It's a necessary part of planning at both the strategic and the tactical levels. If we don't think through all of the factors that can and will affect our plan, we don't have a plan. It's not complete. Sometimes only one part of that plan may change. Other times, every part of that plan may change, sometimes one at a time, or maybe even all at once. The more we consider in planning, the faster we as leaders and our organization will react and adapt during execution. So before we get going, who are we? We're the Talent War Group. We're powered by EF Overwatch, but we're a leaders collective that has come together because of our experience in building elite teams and to help manage the most important asset on the balance sheet, and that's human capital. Our team consists of some of the most experienced special operations operators, academics, professors, and business leaders who've led teams in the most complex of challenges. We've assessed, selected, trained, developed, and led winning teams in the military, in business, and we've done this from 1-2 people alone and unafraid to 1,000-man organizations. It takes an understanding of talent and how to manage that talent and the people around you to build winning organizations day in and day out. So we came together, we share our experiences and the value that we've taken from everything we've done with everybody in our audience. We share it with each other, and we collectively hope to grow from that. Today, we got a great panel of guests, so I want to take a second and introduce all of them. So first, Dalton Rice. Dalton was a Green Beret in the U.S. Army, served tours in the Middle East, Europe, Africa. When he got out, he served in various operational and administrative roles in healthcare and the public sector, and now he serves as a city manager in local government administration at Morgan's Point Resort, where he oversees multiple departments to provide services to nearly 5,000 residents. Thanks, Dalton, and welcome. We have Dan Luna. Dan was a Navy SEAL, and he's now a certified leadership coach and a doctoral student at USC. He runs a small leadership coaching company called Team 3LX, and in 2020, he published Leading from Within, a leader's guided journal. And he's got some great points today, and I know we're going to get to those real quick. We hope to have with us Joe Barnard, who's a 33-year Air Force veteran, and here he is right here. Served as a PJ, retired as a lieutenant colonel, commanded 3 times at the highest level, and he's currently the executive director of the Forge School. Welcome to the panel, Joe.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
All right, and we have Naira. Naira is an intern with EF Overwatch in the Talent War Group. She keeps us in check, keeps us in line, and she'll roll all this up at the end to make sure we hit the highlights and give you the summary takeaway points. It's kind of a competition here to see who makes the best points that make her list of 3. So thanks for hosting and putting this all together. All right, so let's get into it, right? Leaders in all types of organizations spend countless hours planning. Strategy teams develop endless PowerPoint decks. Engineers, they slam Red Bull and they code for days on end. Financial analysts create mind-numbingly detailed Excel spreadsheets. Football coaches often script out at every level the first 10 to 20 plays of a game. But what happens once that plan starts? A German field marshal had a quote for the ages, and he said that no plan survives first contact, that we need to account for everything that can and will happen. The branches and sequels, the what ifs, the situational football, as Bill Belichick calls it. If A happens, we do B. If X happens, we do Y. Military decision process teaches military leaders to build flow charts, decision matrix, branches and sequel trees to account for every condition and factor that will come into play. Whether it's business, sports, the military, external factors have a say in how the plan is executed. The competition has input. The other team, the other companies that are competing against you with similar products or similar strategy, they've developed a plan to combat our plan. Tech companies reverse engineer product rollouts in hours and days, not weeks and months like it used to. Employee issues will arise, market conditions will change. Even the weather gets a vote. unless you live in South Florida or Hawaii, and then you don't have to worry about the weather. But in New England, it gets a vote. So I want to turn it over to the panel. I want to start with throwing a question out and go around the room. But let's start with Dan. Dan, as a leadership coach and with the organization that you put together, as you work with people in all types of organizations, small business, medium-sized businesses, young leaders, what process or framework do you use to identify what are the factors that will affect your plan? Because it's easy to conceptually think about all these things that can happen. But if you have to sit in a room and say, all right, everybody put your head together, how are we going to approach this? What do you look for?
So I had some points lined up that I was going to go through, and you just said some stuff, Fran, in the opening, and great opening, by the way. And it teased out some thoughts that I had, and you asked some questions, the what ifs, and how do we plan? And those are both questions. And what I've noticed with leaders and a lot of leaders that I work with, it's to keep it very simple, because diving into contingency planning, and I love the title of this, contingency planning, without it, there's no strategy. It's asking questions and having a protocol around it to ask the questions. And you're trying to create more awareness. And if you want to create more awareness, it's not through making statements, it's through asking questions. And even more specifically, what questions? When you ask a what question, you're asking a knowledge-based question. When you ask a how or a do, you're asking an action-based question. Why questions tend to go down a different route. And so when I work with clients, we try and stay away from why questions. And I know there's a lot of different models out there that use why questions, but essentially keep it simple, keep it realistic, and ask a lot of questions and have the environment of safety and trust within the team to ask those questions. And when you ask the questions and you go through contingency planning, we often think of external events. If you do quick Google searches, or if you look at research on why business fails or bad things that happen, so many of those events are actually internally based. So sometimes we're focused on external things when maybe we should direct that attention to internal. There's multiple stories on, and the one I'm thinking of right now is where NASA submitted measurements, and the scientists used 3 different measuring systems, and so that obviously threw everything off. And so it was just sticking with the basics, keeping things realistic, and ask questions. And ask a lot of questions that are focused internal and not necessarily all external. And I'll just pause there.
You bring up some great points, Dan and Fran, and talking about the intro, I had some bullet points lined out, and we'll kind of talk about those. But I want to touch on what Dan said about questions, and I want to take it a step further. And you actually have to ask those questions. And too often, from my own experiences and bringing up young leaders and even experienced leaders, they're afraid to ask the questions, or they're just downright not asking the questions. And so if you want to elicit that response and you want to be able to plan for the contingencies and not just hope that they're going to go away, you have to ask those questions. And not only do you have to ask those questions, you have to accept whatever answer that may be in order to come up with another solution. And so one of my, I don't want to say it's a pet peeve of mine, but something I always kind of touch on is people always say, well, it takes time. Change takes time. No, well, change takes time and influence. And that influence comes from what Dan was saying about asking those right questions. And you ask those questions, which we talk about, and Joe is going to kind of touch on this next, is the decision-making process. And how do we plan for that? So when we talk about contingencies, what is most likely going to happen, and what is the most unlikely thing that's going to happen, but we still need to ask it, because if we plan for it, then it's not going to surprise us.
Yeah, I think those are great comments, great intro. The first thing I would say about keeping it simple, that always means to me, don't make it more complex than what it is. That doesn't mean you dumb stuff down all the way to nub level and nub beyond where you're at. But people tend to make stuff more complex, which I think is very inefficient. The next thing is your planners. Your planners should be some of your best people. And all of us in this group here, we rather be tacticians than be on the staff. You go to the staff kicking and screaming. My two of my 3 staff tours were in Hawaii, so I didn't go kicking and screaming. I surfed a lot. But you really need to go and represent the tacticians as you're doing these contingency plans. So you really want to send your best people up to sort of represent what's going on. And sort of the pink elephant in the room on sort of the military planning is there are career staffers, and the career staffers don't have the appropriate gumption to represent the policies and procedures and techniques that the ConOps, the concept of operations, the plan org requires. And that's why you need to send some of your best people up from the tactical level to go do these. So those are my initial comments based on what you guys had. That's good stuff.
So I want to go down and discuss a point that all 3 of you guys brought up. And that's this concept that you have to teach leaders how to think, not what to think. How do you define that, right? Because often we get people in a room and we say, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. But really, when you talk about contingency planning, because there's so many factors of the unknown that you may not even consider when you sit down and make your plan, and then you make your plan of all the things that can happen. If you create an environment where your subordinates expect you to tell them how to do something, how do you build the most successful organizations in which you have to teach those around you how to think through a problem? I didn't say it was going to be easy on this session.
Well, Fran, let me touch on that real quick. And I think it's kind of twofold. To be very frank, you can't spoon feed everybody. If you spoon feed everybody, that's the expectation that they're going to have. And why would they take it upon themselves to critically think through a problem if they know that every single time Dalton's going to come in here and say, well, this is great, but how about we do this, 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 and this? And they're like, well, I give up. I'm just going to wait until Dalton tells me again next time. And you perpetuate that cycle.
Yeah, I think my 2 comments on that is play the long game. The plan's going to evolve. There's going to be an exercise life cycle and a planning life cycle associated with the plan. It's going to get better year 4 than it was year 1, 2, and 3 as you go along. And then what we do all the time and how we've grown and how we grow leaders is debrief. You have got to debrief everything. Debrief, and then learn from that. And each individual and the enterprise progresses off that debrief.
So I'm hearing 2 things. Sorry, the leadership coach is coming out. I'm hearing a how, so that's an action. So now we're moving to solution. So if we're asking how questions, we're actually moving ahead of ourselves. So moving back to the what and what is the problem? What are the problems that can happen? So just exploring the problems and then solutions. And so as we're kind of breaking these up, and even in this conversation, as we're starting to put things in buckets, just like a company would beta test and iterate something, or start out small, iterate it before rolling out something big. Planning's no different. So each organization, each team, they're different. Some just show up and like, hey, let's figure this out with no protocols. You can do that. That is a way. Is there a better way to answer that question? Is what I always like posing. Hey, this is what I'm noticing. Is there a better way to answer this question? Is there protocols that you've used in the past? And so some of those protocols is, hey, let's focus on the problem and let's create awareness around this. And so how do you create awareness? That goes back to the questions, The what questions, focus on the problem. And you could almost, if I had a board, we could almost like follow this talk track all the way down. And to create more awareness, it's funny, there's a bunch of research, reflection, self-reflection, and awareness is kind of like my thing. And so many people think they're self-aware, and it's that 80-20 rule. Most are not, because they want to make statements. And if you go back to the questions, and I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but I want to also pose the distinction between a question and questioning. And now you're also talking about the environment that you're creating within the team space. So if Dalton says something, I can ask a question. Well, Dalton, that was really interesting. Do you mind elaborating? Vice, maybe, Dalton, why would you say something like that? Or where are you coming from with that? Or what, some other frame to where you're still asking a question, but one's question and one's questioning. So just understand the distinction between that, and then what that does for the energy within the team.
So let's talk about the team and those dynamics, because Dan, you bring up the point about creating an environment where people can question and they can kind of throw things out there to have to consider. So Joe, 33 years in the Air Force, right? In special operations, there's a perception, and I'm going to call it a misconception. It's a misperception and a misconception that in the military, everything is top down. Well, what I tell people all the time is that actually it's not. And what the military does to leaders at the top is it teaches you to embrace bottom-up feedback, especially in special operations, because when you're in charge, you actually sometimes know the least of everybody in that organization. So sometimes that's difficult to translate into the business world, where you can get into organizations where somebody who's junior may feel pressured to not speak up and bring up things that their boss comes to when they realize that maybe it's not the right answer. So how do you create an environment to allow for what Dan and Dalton have both talked about, where somebody can stand up regardless of their position in the organization and say, I don't think you considered Y to your X?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, what you have to do as a leader is you have to have humility, and you have to show your warts, and people have to see your warts, and they have to see your confidence and how you're your own biggest fan to advance past some of your flaws. And then you also have to delegate really well, and you give people left to right limits, and then you don't kick them into junk when they fail. You sort of help them, guide them, mentor, groom them past that failure so growth happens. And so if you have those two things, that's where the culture of, even though like I'm a vertical organization here with the 35 people I have with this school we just started, we delegate down to the lowest level. That's sort of what has to happen. And the information flow up and down has to be there. So it takes effort to do these things, but it absolutely is worthwhile. And that's sort of my input there.
Dalton?
Yeah, one of the audience members, Tony Long, said something, that kind of struck a chord with me. Empowerment. Empowerment of your employees is key. Empowerment of your team is key. If you empower your employees to challenge themselves, to succeed, to grow, they're going to continue to do so. Vice, they don't, and they kind of just go through the motions. So what Tony said really kind of, really struck a chord with me, and excuse me, and it kind of goes back to add on to that. We're hearing a lot of the audience talk about after action reviews and debriefs, and Doug Miller talked about after action review process, and they're extremely important in the planning process and in the strategy process. But it goes back to what Dan said at the beginning, asking the questions, the what. And too often we see a lot of, and again, this is also what Joe says, we're tying it all together, is having the humility to be able to say, what, this after action review is not just going to talk about the good, but it's also going to talk about the bad. Because in order to come up with a solution, you have to identify a problem. And so, please put your comments in there, put some of your questions in there. What have you seen that works and what doesn't work?
I I like real simple things. And I was getting ready to make fun of myself, and I won't right now. So, Joe, and I love what you said, just keep it simple. And so even with this, people want to be seen, heard, and understood. And you're like, oh, okay, that's simple, but it's not easy. So truly seen, heard, and understood. So what is something that you can do within your team that covers those things? And it's being a powerful listener. So we've talked about asking questions and speaking, and the other half is not speaking and just being powerful, being present, listening to both language, body, and emotion within your team. And through that, you're creating trust. You're creating safety within that space through asking questions, not questioning, and being a powerful listener so that individual knows that you're seeing them, that you're understanding them, and that they're being heard.
So let's talk. Let's talk about the failure side of things. And I was going to go in one direction, and then Greg Freeman just posted a comment in here referencing Joe's comment about not kicking them in the junk. Let's talk about failure. All right. I mean, if you sit in a leadership position and you have this obligation and this sense of duty to not let it fail, and you have to think through all of these contingencies, and you've built the team to provide the bottom-up feedback, and everybody's doing it, what happens when it fails? So, Joe, you get first crack at that one.
Yeah, I mean, basically, what I'm doing here with these boys, I mean, we have developmental trauma teen boys here that need some really deep work, and these homes are dysregulated bad. My old job in the military, rescuing people, I mean, you really can't, there's failure has already happened, and you're trying to fix that failure based on sort of the ringing the bell and go out there. And so the way to eliminate failure is to train your ass off. You have got to, I love full mission profiles, but you got to do part task trainers before the full mission profiles. And you do them over and over and over again in repetition. And so you got to know your policies and procedures. You got to know what actions you're going to take, and you rehearse them as much as you can and mimic what the actual execution event will look like. And that's how you sort of eliminate failure. And so my kick in the junk comment came from, listen, man, I had UCMJ authority over folks 3 different times in my career. You can absolutely be a dictator in that job, but you ain't going to last too long. You absolutely have to listen to your chiefs. You have to listen to your number 2. You have to listen to all sorts of your first sergeant. You have to listen to all sorts of people on how you're navigating the mission as you're going along. And so, like we said, small failures are good. You can learn from those small failures, and that's where growth happens. It's a big failures when people lose their fingers in tow or you damage expensive equipment. That's the stuff that you don't want to have happen. And so you've got to train, and the repetition is what, gives you that strong foundation to stand on to move forward.
So follow-up question, Joe, I'm not letting you off the hook yet. You talked about big failures versus small failures. Okay. How do you and can you bounce back from a big failure? It happens to a lot of people. I mean, when you look at selection processes for whether it's Green Beret selection or Navy SEAL selection or PJ selection, the big theme they have is bounce back. Can you be resilient as an operator to accept a failure, learn from it, and bounce back? How do you create that environment? Yeah,
I think individually that's, as you're going through these training pipelines are not easy physically, mentally, and the individual sort of has to have that. Big failures to me is like when we lose guys. When you have pictures of dead guys on squadron walls, that's failure. And so, you debrief the hell out of it and you go, man, is this something that could have been avoided? Is this something that, the enemy and the environment has to say? Operational failures you could bounce back from. Training failures, like training fatalities, should that ever happen? No, there's a decision chain. There's a, that whole chain of wrongness, sort of, just made up a word there, sort of flows through there, So, that's sort of how I looked at that, man. You got to be your own biggest fan, and you got to realize you're doing some dangerous stuff, especially what we used to do. where you could lose your fingers and toes and get hurt and fall out at any time. It's like, you don't want to be the Winkest Lake. So I don't know. You just attack it when it comes to the individual side of that.
You're absolutely right. And, Brand said something earlier that really, from the special forces side of things, about bottom up solutions and bottom up leadership. When we got new, Green Beret officers that came onto the team, it's like, hey, go sit in the corner. We'll deal with you here in a minute, because the teams are run by the guys. The officer on the team, for especially on ODAs or our operational detachment alphas, we're the ones that ran the show. We put in all the information. We did all the back end support. We did all the contingency planning. The officer was just there to make sure he communicated that message to battalion and higher so we could get the money and get the funds that we needed to do the job. So I want to at least touch on that point, Fran.
Dan?
I'm pausing for effect. So I'm going to push back a little bit on this and go back to my comment about listening and the words that we're speaking out to our team in the team environment. I'm not a fan of the word failure. I think there's other words that could be better used. I think sometimes when we say things like "don't be afraid to fail," or certain language can be used out there, in the back of somebody's mind, it's such a powerful word. I think it should be reserved for certain times. There's mistakes and there's errors. So there's other language that we can use to say, hey, are we training? Hey, if we're training, hey, go ahead and push it. If mistakes come out, hey, that's okay. That's what we're here to do. We're here to pressurize during training or during certain things, because that's where we want to see where those limits are. If something's going to crack, that's what we actually want to see. If we use the word failure, even in training, I think there's hesitation in the back of somebody's mind, because typically what I've seen with high performers is nobody wants to fail. People don't even like making mistakes. So it's like, hey, let's at least create an environment. Once again, I go back to that safe and trust environment. Hey, we're actually here to pressurize. We're not testing. Are we training or are we testing? Because those are two different things. Are we doing real events? Are we operating, right? Is this something real world that, hey, business, government, military, whatever it is, we need to limit everything. So we're really going to pay attention to how we're doing things. So my pushback is just on the language and when it's used, and even the mindset going into it. Like, hey, because there is an appropriate time to make mistakes and make errors, and those are great teaching opportunities and moments of learning, and then to move from there and just to really examine where you're using that word and make sure you're using it appropriately and at the right time.
I would say too, Dan, that you have to define mistake, error, failure, and what does that mean? And I'll tell a short story here, even though I'm not good at telling short stories, because I live this firsthand. I mean, my very first real mission as a Special Forces Detachment Commander, we planned for everything. We planned for absolutely everything. Getting in contact, having to cross a river, working with an indigenous force, everything you can think of, we thought of. We planned for all of them independently, and then 1 minute on the battlefield, everything happened at once. I was in contact. We were bogged down in an area we didn't know. Our forces were separated. We had one of our Americans was shot. We had guys in the water, and we had an indigenous force drowning, all at once. And to sit there and we finished that mission. And when we were done, I was 100% confident that we failed. Failure across the board. But what happened was, we had a mission, and our mission was to go out there and eliminate the enemy, which we did. And so by definition of the mission, did we fail? No. Were there errors? Absolutely. All over the place. Were there mistakes that we had to learn from? Yes. But was it a true failure? not in the terms of the operation. So how you define those things, whether it be in your business, in the military, as an athlete, and your personal performance goals, as you relate those to your competition, there's going to be failure as you define it, and then there's going to be mistakes and errors that you can come back from and learn from and move on. So I want to go into traits and characteristics. Everybody hit on some here. They threw some of them out. We always talk about them around here. Mike and George wrote about them in the talent war. So I want to go around. I want to talk about the top 2-3 traits that you each believe are critical to become a leader who thinks about contingencies in their in their planning strategy sessions. So let's go to Joe.
Yeah, I think one, you have to be your own biggest fan. I think I've said that already. You got to have a confidence in yourself that you can do it, and that doesn't mean you know how to do it right now. So it's the second trait is I'm willing to learn. Are you teachable? You absolutely have to be teachable. You don't know everything. Team is so much better than self. All those things that sort of go with that. And then the third one is you got to have energy. If you don't have energy to progress and push forward, chin up, chest out, eyes dilated as you attack your windshield, I mean, you're off to the races if you have those things. And they're not easy to get. But, man, if you work on them and you sort of run a OODA loop on attacking those three, I've just seen guys do amazing stuff and progress amazingly in life when they do that stuff.
Dan?
Reflection. Reflect. And reflection is to deeply consider. And so just to constantly reflect internally. And reflection can also be a team event as well. We often think, so an AAR or a before action review, those are all forms of reflection. So even what we're talking about here is planning. We're essentially planning for the future. It's called reflection on the future. So we're asking questions, we're listening, and we're reflecting.
To add on to what Joe and Dan have said, I'd say the three that I think are important and they hit home to me is humility, adaptability, and resiliency. And it kind of covers a lot. And one of our audience members, William S., talked about critical leadership trait equals empathy. And I think our values, our core values that we all hold, our characteristics, what we define them as really encompasses almost all of these to a certain extent. For me, career development and transitioning out of the military I failed miserably at it. And I didn't plan as much as I should, even though I preach it. And so having the humility to be able to look at yourself in the mirror, self-awareness, and say, I can do this and I will do this, being able to adapt and say, all right, I have a plan, but now let's throw it out the window and go a different direction. And resiliency to say, this sucks and I hate this, but I need to get up and keep going. And who else can I help along the way while I'm doing this?
Let's talk about the rabbit hole. We were talking about it before the show, and we have some. We all work, whether it was in the military or whether it is in the corporate world. We have really creative folks out there. Often I tell my teams that I'm the least creative person that sits in the room. When we start working through these different frameworks and protocols that everybody discussed here, how do you stop from going down the rabbit hole? How do you keep it realistic? Because weird things happen every day. I mean, look at the situation we're in, right now with COVID, right? And a combination of things that have occurred, over the last 10 months since COVID came. Somebody would easily sit there and say, well, maybe we planned for, political unrest. Maybe we planned for pandemic. Well, did we plan for them to happen at the same time? I don't know. Should we have? Who knows? But how do you keep it realistic and focused on what may actually happen?
Yeah, so you absolutely have to have an outside the box COA for the other two sort of conventional COAs that you get. And so, you know, COA development is part of the military decision-making process and the mission analysis. And, you know, that's an 8-hour conversation on our own to sort of go into those details. But if you always ask for an outside the box COA, you probably won't use it, but you'll use parts of it inside the other stuff. Another thing is, you know, change rarely happens from the establishment. You know, somebody said that somewhere, right? None of my thoughts are original here, but you know, you could be an entrepreneur inside the bureaucracy. And especially if you're in a position of leadership, if you walk into a group and say, man, I like the creativity you showed there. If you give that verbal feedback and sort of work through the 5 W's and the cost of what the person is talking about, the culture inside the unit, inside the organization will progress with that.
Dan?
So I would say, I'm going to pass it off to Dalton. I'm going to think on this a little bit more. Dalton, you okay with that?
Yeah, you know, and you know, one thing too, and Joe brought up a good point about COAs. You know, COAs are course of action, and when we talked about it a little bit, and in the military decision-making process, MDMP, we talk about the most dangerous course of action and the most probable course of action. And I mean, hell, we don't want to go down rabbit holes, and how do we stop that? And I think as flawed as the MDMP can be, it brings up a lot of great points of, well, what is the most dangerous possibility of X, Y, and Z happening? And then go down a couple of that, you know, go down the rabbit hole. But realistically, you know, aliens shouldn't be involved in that process. And then your most probable course of action is, okay, based off of the statistics, based off of the data, based off of the facts and our observations, we could relatively safely assume that this is most probably what's going to happen. You know, and in municipal government, we deal with this all the time. You know, we could go down a million different rabbit holes, from streets to drainage to stormwater. How does it impact, you know, how does one city impact our city? We're going through that now. And so I wanted to touch on COAs because I use COAs every single day to help keep me focused. And, you know, the last thing before I turn it over to Dan, you know, we talked about planning, but brief backs are also important. And in Special Forces ODAs, and Fran, you know, led these for guys like us on the enlisted side, is having a plan is one thing, but having your team be able to brief back every single aspect of that plan and the contingencies and the most dangerous and the most probable courses of action help guys and empower the team to be able to, you know, think on their own and to be able to critically think through problems.
Okay, Dan, you're not off the hook, so you got to go.
I'm ready.
All right.
So I love rabbit holes, and I love rabbit holes because that's where some of the creativity comes out. So I think it's both. I think it's like we're talking about framework, so something very controlled and structured. And then on the other side of that, we're also talking about creativity of outside the box thinking. Hey, what are some things that can happen? And you can use things like historics or past experience or, you know, current environment or, you know, trends, you know, everything from game theory to SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 Force, right? So there's different models out there. So some of that creativity can be out there, can it come out to maybe wrangle it. You can time bound it. You can bound it by time. So when you bound it by time, you're working both that control to where you're going through the model, and then that creative mindset or that creative side, especially if there's somebody that's more creative, you're giving them the space to explore and to pose those ideas that may not come out from other members in a group.
Successful answer, Dan, but you had so much time to think about it, so we have to score accordingly. I want to go to a question from Joe Brejda, and hopefully I said that right, Joe. But Joe asks, what are some best practices you've seen for avoiding analysis paralysis in contingency planning? and how do you define the boundaries? So yeah, how do you get out of the hamster wheel, where we talked about rabbit holes, we talked about the most probable course of action, the most dangerous course of action, the most likely course of action. Well, when do you stop and say, okay, we've got enough? And in your answer, because again, I said it wasn't going to be easy, I want to talk about risk assessment, because risk assessment has to be a part of when do you actually stop that wheel of thought.
So what I would say is, on the front end of that, you got to have a timekeeper, and you got to have left and right limits. You don't even let the hamster wheel inside the room. And there definitely are people that love to hear themselves talk and want to keep it going and never solve a problem. Sometimes they get kicked out of the room, and that's a good thing for them and the room. When it comes to risk assessment, there's risk mitigators and there's risk avoiders. And risk avoiders are the people that don't have gumption, like I said, on the front end. They're career staffers. They don't understand the risk of the business, whether it's business development or actually physical risk. And so risk mitigation comes through your training and through discussion with SMEs and people that have been there. And so you've got to document that stuff, and you got to chart it, and you got to sort of evaluate it and debrief it as it goes along. And so, man, if you want to see a cool debrief, watch the the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds debrief after they fly. You want to see something cool? They talk about 2% they did wrong for an hour, and like there's 5 seconds of high fives on the 98% they did right while they're doing it. That's how you avoid risk, by having that type of culture as you move along.
You silenced Professor Dan over here, so we have to give him more time to think. What do you got, Dalton?
Joe said it best. I think he silenced most of us. I think we're just going to have to leave it at that one.
All right. Well, at some point we could talk about this all day long, and we could go down all the rabbit holes on all the different topics that we had. What I would encourage everyone who's listening and everybody who cares about these topics, send in your comments. Contact us directly. Reach out to us on thetalentwar.com. We're happy to continue the conversation through all social media platforms and directly with you and your teams, if it will bring benefit to your teams and your organizations, because we like talking about this stuff, and we want to hear from everybody. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nayara. She's going to tell us who won here and give us a summary.
Thanks, Fran. Firstly, I wanted to start by assessing that contingency planning is something that never really goes according to plan. Something that happens almost actually every time is nothing going to according to plan. But it's smart to plan, but it's also very smart to know that the plan might suffer other contingencies. So we need to account for the fact that options A to Z will happen, and that you need to be prepared for those. Another main topic was about the dynamic of teams, about how everyone on the team can and should stand out no matter what position you're in. Everyone should have a chance to express their opinions and unravel their ideas. But as a leader, you need to be humble and understand the reason why your subordinate did a certain task in the way that they did it. Secondly, if your subordinate fails, you need to empower them so they can learn from their mistakes and make them motivated to improve on their future tasks. And in order to do that, there's a few main behaviors that you should adopt, no matter if you're a leader or a subordinate in an organization. And as Joe mentioned, you need to be your biggest fan. And you also have to be teachable and willing to learn. And you have to have that energy to keep yourself motivated and keep learning. Dan talked about how self-reflection is essential to modify unwanted behaviors, and Dalton added that humility, adaptability, and resiliency are also main factors that will keep you in check. And lastly, you need to be prepared for both the most probable course of action, but also you need to have a good time limit and assess your risks, because at some point you need to stop thinking in order so you can start acting and achieve your plan and succeed.
Awesome. Thinking versus acting. I like that. I think we can have a whole session on thinking versus acting. So someone's got to take that one and start planning it. So we can't get out of here without plug in the next session. So if you like what you heard here and you've listened to us before and you want to keep going, the next session is going to be on next Tuesday, January 26th. It's going to be hosted by George Randall, the author of The Talent War, and Carly Walden from EF Overwatch. They're going to be talking about what they're calling your biggest hiring mistake. So interviewing techniques, evaluation criteria, and metrics, and how are we going to go about hiring in the post-COVID world. So thanks everyone again for taking the time. This Talent War Group podcast, we're excited to be here. We're excited you joined us. We're produced by EF Overwatch. If you liked what you heard and you want more, go to talentwar.com, efoverwatch.com, all of us on social media, connect with us on LinkedIn, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.